I'll be reading from Amos 4. Hear this word, you cows of Bashan, who are on the mountain of Samaria, who oppress the poor, who crush the needy, who say to your husbands, bring that we may drink. The Lord God has sworn by his holiness that, behold, the days are coming upon you, when they shall take you away with hooks, even the last of you with fish hooks. And you shall go out through the breaches, each one straight ahead, and you shall be cast out into Harmon, declares the Lord. Come to Bethel and transgress, to Gilgal and multiply transgression. Bring your sacrifices every morning, your tithes every 3 days. Offer a sacrifice of thanksgiving of that which is leavened, and proclaim free will offerings, publish them. For so you love to do, O people of Israel, declares the Lord. I gave you cleanness of teeth in all your cities, and lack of bread in all your places. Yet you did not return to me, declares the Lord. I also withheld the rain from you when there were yet 3 months to the harvest. I would send rain on one city and send no rain on another city. One field would have rain, and the field on which it did not have rain would wither. So 2 or 3 cities would wander to another city to drink water and would not be satisfied. Yet you did not return to me, declares the Lord. I struck you with blight and mildew, your many gardens and your vineyards, your fig trees and your olive trees, the locusts devoured, yet you did not return to me, declares the Lord. I sent among you a pestilence after the manner of Egypt. I killed your young men with the sword and carried away your horses. And I made the stench of your camp go up into your nostrils. Yet you did not return to me, declares the Lord. I overthrew some of you, as when God overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah, and you were as a brand plucked out of the burning, yet you did not return to me, declares the Lord. Therefore, thus I will do to you, O Israel, because I will do this to you. Prepare to meet your God, O Israel. For behold, he who forms the mountains and creates the wind and declares to man what is his thought, who makes the morning darkness and treads on the heights of the earth, the Lord, the God of hosts, is his name.
We wanna see your justice come out here. Let justice roll like a river, righteousness like a mighty stream. Let justice roll. Let justice roll like a river, righteousness like a mighty stream.
Good afternoon, New Eden family. As always, it's just a joy to be with God's church. I hope and pray each of you are doing well on this Labor Day weekend. I did want to echo what Kevin said about making every effort to be at the members meeting. This Wednesday evening, we've got some important stuff to discuss. Again, this is for members of New Eden Church. I also think it'll be just a sweet time for us to come together and pray for the future of our church family. So one of the things that I've been really grateful for in the life of our church family so far is just our intentionality with the discipleship of our children. I think it's really neat to see young children running around, whether they're breaking stuff or whatever. Before and after the service, we had to repair one thing 1 week already. It's been cool to see kids just running around. A big piece of that I'm really grateful for, that I want to let you guys know, is the engagement with children. For those of you that either don't have children or are already, maybe your kids are already grown out of the house, and just engaging with them. We believe that discipleship is a community project, and that includes just the raising of young kids. The whole church is responsible to engage and support that effort. If you've been around kids for any length of time, you know that they soak up whatever they're around, right? And so for parents, you understand this because it means that they pick up your traits, and you get to see your own traits in your kids, right? And you're getting onto them for something, and you realize that that's something you do, or you point out, that that's something your spouse does. One of the things that Caden, our 7-year-old, has picked up is just some sarcasm and wit. Everyone who knows us knows that he gets that from Christy primarily. Not really. He gets that primarily from me. There's some sarcasm, right? So I typically think he's pretty funny, except when it's at my expense. The other day, I was playing a game of football on the Xbox, And he had said something to me. He was telling me how to play better, and he is better at video games than me, but he was telling me how to play something better, and I just kind of ignored him. I was throwing a touchdown pass, so I said, "I'm sorry, Caden. I couldn't hear you over the sound of that touchdown pass I was just throwing." And so a few minutes later, I'm sitting there, and I throw an interception, and Caden, I say something in complaint out loud, and Caden stops what he's doing, and he looks at me, and he says, "I'm sorry, did you say something? I couldn't hear you over the sound of that interception you were just throwing." And so, Caden, that's just the way he is. So I'm trying to learn how to cut out some sarcasm in my life because it's not helpful most of the time. It's ironic, though, that our text today employs a lot of direct sarcasm. Like it's very clear that Amos is being extremely sarcastic with the nation of Israel. Now, just because it's in the Bible, Kevin made sure to point this out in preaching team, doesn't mean I get an excuse to be a sarcastic jerk to everyone else, right? Just because Jesus flipped tables doesn't mean we always need to go flip tables and be angry, right? So same thing with this sarcasm here in the text. But Amos does employ some rich sarcasm to point out Israel's hypocrisy and the false worship of the people of Israel. Amos is very wise and obviously empowered by the Spirit of God in the way he's addressing the nation of Israel. If you remember last week, Kevin preached through all of chapter 3, and he kind of showed us that there was no escape for the people of God. There was no refuge. The only hope for anyone who's underneath the judgment of God is the person and work of Jesus. That's the only hope that any of us have to cling to. And so today in our text, Amos is continuing this judgment and admonition on the nation of Israel. We're going to look at three main things as we make our way through the text. I thought it'd be best today to go ahead and give you those up front. The first thing we're going to look at is false religion. False religion. The second thing we're going to see is full rejection of God. And then the last thing we're going to see is true preparation. So false religion, full rejection, and true preparation. So the first one is false religion. False religion. Right away in verse 1 of our text, we see that Amos gets very specific in talking to a group of people within the nation of Israel. So look at verse 1. We just read it. It says, "Hear this word, you cows of Bashan, who are on the mountain of Samaria, who oppress the poor, who crush the needy, who say to your husbands, bring that we may drink." And so in a second, he's going to address the entire nation of Israel, it seems. But for now, he's talking to a specific group of people called the cows of Bashan. Now, like I said, Amos employs some harsh language to get to the seriousness of his point. So he calls these people cows of Bashan. From some clues, we learn that essentially these cows are the wealthy women of Samaria, which was the capital city of the northern kingdom of Israel. So this word cows, he's referring to these wealthy women. These are Amos's words, not mine. Don't get on to me here. But let me explain something, though. This wouldn't have been the same that we hear it today in our culture. Bashan is an area that was often mentioned a few other places in Scripture. It was always associated with well-fed cattle and with very lush green pastures. And so this reference would have made sense to the hearers of this message. They would have understood that these women are very rich and they're very well taken care of. In the area of material goods, they lack nothing. They have no needs. And ultimately, though, the fact that they're wealthy is not God's main issue with these women. We see very positive examples in Scripture of businesswomen and other wealthy women that use their means for the advancement of the gospel. That's not the issue. What God takes issue with is that while they pile up riches, while they party and they overindulge in strong drink, they are oppressing the poor and crushing the needy. They are gaining their wealth by unjust means. And as they sit there and just enjoy their luxury, they're ignoring the plight of the most vulnerable around them. And as we know in Amos, God is going to have something to say about that. God's not okay with the oppression of humans. And so as is the pattern of the book, God promises judgment on these wealthy women. He swears by his own holiness, which is a sure promise. And he says that essentially they're going to be treated in the same way they treated others. We're not going to read the verses, but they're going to be treated like animals and dragged out into exile. The comfort and security that they have pursued at the cost of others is going to be stripped away from them, and they will be dragged off into exile. And this is again playing on that earlier reference of cows. The tables will be turned back on their own head. And so from this, we learn that lack of justice among a people reveals that there are wicked hearts and that punishment is deemed worthy on these people. And so he's addressing these people as kind of a snapshot of this oppressive culture, as we've already seen over and over in the book. And then he begins to speak more broadly again to the entire kingdom of Israel. In verse 4, he tells them, come to Bethel. He says, come to Bethel. Now, a little bit of context so we know what's going on here. What is Bethel? If you remember last week, it was mentioned in our text as the place where the horns of the altar was. At the time of Amos and this prophecy, Bethel had become this sacred place where Israel was supposed to come and meet God for the northern kingdom of Israel. It had become sacred. If you remember, it was the place that Jacob had met God in a dream when he saw the angels descending and ascending, and he met God there, and he had these covenant promises affirmed to him, and he calls the place Bethel. And so this had become a sacred place, a place of worship where they were to meet God. And the same thing with Gilgal, which he also mentions in verse 4. It was another sacred place. So Amos tells Israel to come to Bethel and Gilgal. And if you were one of the original hearers of the prophecy, what you would have been expecting Amos to say next is for him to do kind of a call to worship, to call the nation to come together and worship God in all his holiness. The language he uses here of come to Bethel is very similar to what prophets and priests would use to summon people to worship God, but that's not what Amos does. Let's keep reading in verse 4 and 5. He says, come to Bethel, and instead of worship, he says, and transgress. To Gilgal and multiply transgression. Bring your sacrifices every morning, your tithes every 3 days. Offer a sacrifice of thanksgiving of that which is leavened, and proclaim freewill offerings. Publish them, for so you love to do, O people of Israel, declares the Lord God. So instead of calling them to worship, he calls them to come and sin or transgress. This is where Amos begins to get super sarcastic and employs some rich sarcasm. But the main point that Amos is making here is that if you ignore the work of justice around you, or if you are perpetuating injustice in your individual life, then your forms of so-called worship are actually heaping up sin and multiplying transgression. It's a stench in the nostril of God. See, this religion that Israel was engaging in was false because it was not serving the purpose of honoring and glorifying God. It was serving the purpose of their own self-interest and their own passions. It was there simply to make them feel good about themselves so they could go on about their way and do the things they wanted to do. It's an absolute travesty. See, false worship and false religion are not just these kind of indifferent things. They are actually sin. So Amos says, come on and transgress and rebel through coming to the holy places. Bring your sacrifices every morning and every 3 days. This is an ironic statement on purpose that Amos is doing here. According to the Levitical law, they were only supposed to bring their sacrifices once a year, their tithes once every 3 years. And so Amos says once a day and once every 3 days. He exaggerates his point to make clear that no matter how much religious stuff you do, you can't cover up or hide your sin. Your sin still has to be dealt with. Amos goes on and tells them, go ahead and publish it. Like, make it known everywhere. Let the whole earth know how amazing of a person you are because you do these religious things. Let them know how rich you are, how much you can afford to give up and sacrifice. And he tells them, this is what you love to do, or this is what you're loyal to. You love to receive the praise of men. And this is also ironic. Because Israel was never, we need to understand this is important for us. Israel was never called to love the acts of worship. They were called to love the object of worship, Yahweh himself. And there's a difference. This is what they were to be loyal to. It was never about the actual feast or the rituals or the tithes or the sacrifices. It was about who those things pointed to. See, God is not playing games with Israel, and no amount of religious rituals or so-called worship will appease the judgment of God. And not only that, it does the opposite. It multiplies the judgment of God. Because at least the wicked don't pretend to be right with God. They don't pretend to be religious. They don't use God and manipulate him for their own gain. This reminds me of the Pharisee in the Gospel of Luke who stood up and he prayed aloud, thanking God that he wasn't like all these sinners around him. Or the story when Jesus noticed the small gift from the widow who gave out of her poverty versus the rich who would dump out sums of money just so people could see them. And what a sober warning to us today. What an absolutely incredible reminder that our heart matters and that all of life 24/7, not just when we're doing the religious stuff, it all matters. The way we treat others matter. I don't know if you can for us to kind of understand how shocking this would have been for Amos to stand up and say, come to Bethel, come to Gilgal and transgress. Maybe we could imagine the prophet Amos before us today as we were to start our gathering at New Eden Church. And we would expect him to read our traditional call to worship. But instead, he just stands up and he says, welcome to New Eden. We're glad you are all here to join us in our sin. Go on, church. Attend church 3 times a day. Give 50% of your income as your tithe. Take communion every morning. Read your Bible through once a month. Give offerings out of every paycheck. Attend 5 missional community groups. And then go publish on Facebook everything you're doing so everyone knows, and tell everybody how amazing you think your church is. I mean, this is what you guys all love to do, right? And we might get a little offended, right? Like, I'm getting a little offended at this hypothetical Amos who's standing before us. I'm like, bro, you don't know our hearts. Like, back off a little bit, right? But the point here is not to say that all those things are bad in and of themselves. Amos isn't saying, stop doing all those things. Obviously, God commanded those to be done. But when we find ourselves engaging in supposed acts of worship without love for the object of our worship, we have a problem. And our love for others in the public sphere, in the world around us, reflects whether or not we really love the object of our worship, God himself. Anybody can show up here. Anybody can give the tithes. Anybody can set that up. But love for God and love for others is a heart transformative thing. Amos makes it clear that being the covenant people of God is a all of life proposition. We can't just compartmentalize it out. It's not okay to come to church on Sunday and then ignore injustice all around us throughout the week. It's not okay to publish our mission trip pictures on Facebook of us going overseas to Africa, but then ignore and be cold toward the voices of our black and brown brothers and sisters across the street. That's a stench in God's nostrils. It's not okay to mail in our tithe every week to the church, but demean, belittle, or ignore the homeless or unemployed in our communities. It's not okay for us to give a bunch of money to go toward mission work in Mexico, but then hate the foreigner and the immigrant among us. It's not okay to serve in New Eden Kids every week, but then be indifferent about the trafficking of children or the reality of abortion around us. It's not okay to read our Bible and pray every day, but then defend, excuse, or perpetuate racist or sexist narratives. It's not okay to come take communion every week where we remember a God who laid down his life for us, but then defend, excuse, or perpetuate violence, destruction, and theft in our pursuit for justice. See, the way of Yahweh is a holistic, all-of-life thing, and we trust the means of this journey, not just the end. We trust Jesus. Jesus told his disciples, lose your entire life. Everything's on the table. Everything we hold dear is on the table, and Jesus doesn't just conform us to his image at certain times. He doesn't just call us to some religious activities. He calls us to follow him with every single part of us, and that doesn't mean we're going to get it perfect. That's not the goal here. It does mean that when we don't get it right, we listen. We humbly repent, and we turn to him and ask him to transform our heart. See, here's the thing that we need to understand and that the text teaches us today about our false religion. It's not just this indifferent thing. It's actually a full rejection of God himself, which is the second main thing we look at in this passage, full rejection. In verses 6 through 11, we're not going to read them all, but Amos reminds the nation of Israel of multiple judgments that God had already sent to them. And he does this, he had sent these judgments to try to get the nation of Israel to turn back to God, to quit trusting your own way. Hey, it's not going to pan out, so here's another judgment. There were 5 primary judgments. There was famine. He says they had no bread, a cleanness of teeth, which just meant they had nothing to eat, so they didn't have to worry about their teeth getting dirty. They had drought. He said they would wander from town to town looking for drink. Nothing would satisfy their thirst. And then he says that they had destroyed crops, they had military defeat, but through all of this, though all of their own ways led to this destruction, Israel would not return to God. And that's the main point and refrain of these verses. 5 times, look at it, Amos 4, 6, 8, 9, 10, and 11. God says, yet you did not return to me. See, all of these judgments from God were done out of love. I mean, God had told them all the way back in Deuteronomy chapter 4 that when times of hardship came as a result of their rebellion, they were to turn back to Yahweh, and he was ready to hear. Deuteronomy 4:30 says, when you're in tribulation and all these things come upon you in the latter days, you will return to the Lord your God and obey his voice. For the Lord your God is a merciful God. He will not leave you or destroy you or forget the covenant with your fathers that he swore to them. God promised that they would find him if they would seek him in return. We're going to see that more in chapter 5 because God calls them to seek after him and they would be forgiven. But Israel refused to do so time and time again. Israel rejected his grace. See, at the root of all of our oppression of others, at the root of all of our false worship and religion, at the root of all of our pursuit of comfort and security at any cost is the desire to be satisfied. But true satisfaction comes from God himself, not just his blessings, not the things that he provides. Another thing we learn from these verses is that no amount of judgment can cause a hard heart to return to God. See, the nation of Israel was not just in need of some tweaks, maybe some new laws, maybe a fresh start. They needed a whole new heart, a whole new life, a whole new way, and it's no different for us. See, ultimately, Israel rejected God because they didn't want him. They didn't return to him because they didn't want what he required of them, and they knew that they were unprepared to meet him, and we do the same thing. That's why we can refashion God into our own image and assume that he always thinks the way we think and likes the things we like. That's when we start calling evil good and good evil. We refashion him into our own image. Or maybe we try to compartmentalize him. Like we just take this part of our life and say, God, you can have this part, like from Sundays on 5 to 6:30, but then this part over here, like it's just kind of stay out of this part of my life. Or maybe we can pretend he doesn't exist, either period or just in certain areas. And when we do that, we're proving that we don't really want God. We just want the things that he can give us. But here's the thing about God, that if we haven't seen this in Amos yet, we're not listening. No matter how much you try to ignore God, no matter how much you try to replace him, no matter how much you try to make him into your own image, no matter how much you reject him, that God cannot be ignored. He will be heard because he is God. That's who he is. That's what we see in verses 12 through 13. At the end of our text, we see this incredibly fearful call to the nation of Israel. He says, therefore, thus I will do to you, O Israel. Because I will do this to you, prepare to meet your God, O Israel. And if we understand that, we should tremble as we read that. Prepare to meet your God. He who forms the mountains and creates the wind and declares to man what is his thought. He can't hide from him. He makes the morning darkness. He treads on the heights of the earth. The Lord, Yahweh, the God of hosts, the God of angel armies is his name. Prepare to meet your God. Now, this language of meeting God was not new to the nation of Israel. When they heard this language of meeting God, there is no doubt they would have remembered the story of Moses, when he brought the nation of Israel to consecrate themselves and to enter into this covenant with God at the base of Mount Sinai. And the people stood at the foot of this mountain to make this covenant with God, and God wouldn't even let them come up because they would have been destroyed. And so they stayed at the base and they got glimpses kind of from a distance. God let Moses come and get just a small glimpse of the back of God passing by for a moment. And so they knew what meeting God meant. It should have been a good thing. It should have been a beautiful thing. But in the book of Amos, for the nation of Israel, this meeting God as they were mired in sin would not be something to look forward to as they were used to hearing. This is very similar to the sarcastic manner which Amos called them to worship. Sarcastically. Say, come sin instead of worship. He's using this language of meeting God, not in a positive way as they would have been used to, but in a fearful way. This Yahweh who forms mountains and creates winds, and he knows the deepest thoughts of man. They can't hide from God. No amount of pious acts can cover a wicked, rebellious, unjust heart. This God is sovereign and he is in charge. He takes the morning light and he makes it dark with judgment. He's not someone you want to reject and rebel against. He's not someone you want to meet with an unjust heart. But even so, in the midst of this dark book and in the midst of this rebellion from the nation of Israel, even in the midst of this full rejection, there seems to be a small glimmer of hope. I mean, this statement, prepared to meet your God, implies that there must be some way to prepare. I mean, obviously, from the text, we know Israel had not done that, but it causes us to ask the question, what would true preparation look like? How could one who had rejected God return to him? How can not only Israel, but those of us who find ourselves in the same position be prepared to meet God? We saw false religion, full rejection, and now we see true preparation. We have to ask the question, who is able to stand before God in all of his blazing, just, holy glory and not be utterly destroyed? Who could be righteous enough to enter into his presence? This is what David asked and answered, thank God, in Psalm 24. Verse 3, he said, who shall ascend the hill of the Lord, and who shall stand in his holy place? Who can do that? He who has clean hands and a pure heart. Clean hands and a pure heart. See, the reality is that there is no human who is prepared to meet God. No one, not from the time of Amos, not till now, who has always acted justly, who has always had pure motives, who has never been deceitful, who has never sought their own glory instead of God. So who is prepared? Who has clean hands and a pure heart? And who can come face to face with God in all his glory and meet him? And the Sunday school answer is the right one. It always is. It's Jesus. He's the only one who can do it. In John chapter 1, we're told that this Jesus was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. See, this word with God in verse 1 has this connotation of being toward God or face to face with God. The man, Jesus Christ, who has been face to face with the blazing glory of the Father from all eternity past, the one who was God himself yet rejected by man, the one who none of us are prepared to meet, this God became flesh and made his home among us. No one had seen this God. No one had experienced him, John tells us. But in Christ, he's now made known. And as John goes on to tell us, this Jesus is way better than Moses, who only got a glimpse of the Father, right, from the back parts. But Jesus has been staring face to face with the Father. And not only that, he is God. He's full of the glory of the Father, full of grace, full of truth. He is the one who has clean hands and a pure heart. And since we rejected Yahweh, and since there was no way that we could be prepared to meet God, he came down to meet us. Like, that should floor us. Like, we are not prepared to meet God, but he came in our mess to meet us, and he chases us down, and he doesn't leave us alone in our guilt and in our shame. And in the person and work of Jesus, instead of us meeting God and darkness taking over the morning light in judgment, now this darkness cannot overcome the light of Jesus. This is the great exchange. This is the gospel. This is in the person and work of Jesus. Only through that can we be prepared to meet God, and can we be made right to him, made right with him, so we can truly worship him in all of life. Only in the person and work of Jesus will all oppression cease. Because when we truly experience Jesus and the glory of him, we are given a new heart, we are made into a new creation, and we are actually transformed from the inside out. See, Jesus came to be crushed underneath the weight of our injustice and sin. And yes, we were unprepared to meet God, but it was Jesus who was placed on the cross of wood on our behalf. It was Jesus who entered into the story of the oppressed and was dragged outside the city, like the women we saw in our text today, forfeiting all comfort and all security, so that he might be scandalously tortured and crucified among rebels. And this cross of wood, this instrument of evil, became the tool that God would use, we need to get this, God would use to break open the Holy of Holies. And as Jesus died, that's exactly what happened. The veil of the temple was torn in two, not to let people peek in, but to let the glory of God out to the entire earth. Remember in Amos when the judgment of God turned the morning to darkness, in the same way, as Jesus was on the cross, darkness covered the earth when the wrath of the Father against sin was poured out on Jesus. And in the moment when death and hell launched its most powerful assault against the Son of God, but the enemy would not have the last word. Because Jesus rose on the third day, and the light of the glory of God burst forth from the tomb, launching this cosmic defeat against the powers of injustice and evil. And he is the hope for both the oppressed and the oppressor. And Jesus met the wrath of God on our behalf. And because he rose victorious, we can now say to the evil one, we can now look Satan in the face and say, prepare to meet your God. And one day, Satan will finally and forever be destroyed. And for those who have met God in the face of Jesus and have trusted in his life, death, burial, and resurrection, this is a day of rejoicing and celebration, not a fearful day. That's why we're called New Eden. That's why we talk about the new creation, because that's the day we long for. We want now, because of Jesus, to meet God, because we've got glimpses of his glory. And when we see it, it transforms us and it changes us. That's why the scriptures say we're transformed from one degree of glory to another. You want change? Look at Jesus and gaze on his beauty. And what happens is our grip on comfort and security is released because we have all satisfaction in Jesus. And then we can work to alleviate the burdens of the poor and the needy around us instead of piling up stacks of crap that's going to burn one day anyways. Like, is that what we're living for? It's empty. As we see Jesus, our grip on man's approval is released, and we can begin to speak out for just laws for the needy. We can speak out on behalf of the oppressed, even if we're hated by all the religious people around us. Join the work of Jesus. That's what happens. We've met Jesus and we've been freed to be used to advance his kingdom. And when we find ourselves in the place of the oppressed or the needy or the poor, we can learn to love our enemies because Jesus loved us when we were his enemies. And we can only do that because we know that injustice doesn't have the last word. Jesus does. In John chapter 4, there's this story of Jesus passing through this town of Samaria. You might recognize the town. It's the same town that we read in our text today, and we've seen multiple times in the book of Amos. And if you remember the story, Jesus in his sovereignty, he's passing through the town of Samaria, and he stops at Jacob's well. And as he sits there, there's this Samaritan woman who approaches Jesus. She approaches the well to draw water. And the text points out that the Samaritan woman was coming at an unusual time on purpose, because she didn't want to have awkward conversations with other people. She was an outcast in the city. She was not only a Samaritan woman, she was also someone who had been married and divorced 5 times and was currently living with a man who was not her husband. Later in the text, we're told that Jesus' disciples are even shocked he's talking to this woman. This was the culture. He shouldn't have been talking to her, especially in a one-on-one situation. Especially a woman from the town of Samaria. She is shocked that he's talking to her. He says, you're a Jew, you don't have anything to, she says, you're a Jew, you don't have anything to do with us Samaritans. What are you doing talking to me? The Jews had grown to hate the Samaritan people, these half-breeds. But Jesus, God in flesh, the same God we're reading about, stops and has a face-to-face conversation with this woman about water. And he asks her to draw him some water. And immediately, again, she's shocked that he's talking to her. So Jesus says, well, if you really knew who I was, you'd be asking me to give you some water. And he says that whoever would drink of this living water that I have will never thirst again. And she says, probably sarcastically, I don't think I'm reading into this, well, why don't you give me some of that so I never have to come do this again? Like, I doubt she actually fully believed. Like, if she just had a sip of water, she'd never thirst again. But she's like, yeah, why don't you tell me about that? I never have to come to this well and draw water again. And so what Jesus does is he so graciously deals with her sin. He tells her her own thoughts and actions. Because of this, she thinks Jesus is some prophet. She starts to get religious, right? I don't know if you've ever done that. People are like, what do you do? I'm like, I'm a preacher. And they're like, oh, I'm sorry I cussed around you. Or, oh, I'm sorry I said this or that. I'm like, it's cool, I promise. I'm just someone trying to point people to Jesus. But she starts getting religious. She probably says the only religious stuff she knows. And she's like, yeah, this mountain is where our forefathers used to worship, here on Samaria. This is the place our fathers used to worship on. And Jesus responds with something incredible in John 4:21. He says, woman, believe me, the hour is coming when neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem will you worship the Father, but the hour is coming and is now here, because Jesus was here, when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth, for the Father is seeking such people to worship him. God is spirit. Those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth. And the woman said to him, I know that Messiah is coming, the one called Christ. When he comes, he's going to tell us of all things. And Jesus looks at her and says, I who speak to you am he. And this woman was changed forever because she met God face to face in the person of Jesus. In the midst of all her sin, in the midst of all her brokenness, she met God. And Jesus uses her to go spread this message of grace. And she says, come here, you got to see this guy. He told me everything I ever did. This Jesus is the same God we saw in Amos, who declares to man his thoughts. And Jesus knows that just like this woman, we would never even begin to know or fathom how to truly worship God on our own. He knows that our hearts are not only broken, but we live in a broken world around us. And I love this story because Jesus confronts both the broken system by talking to this outcast woman, and he also deals with her broken heart by dealing with her sin, and he's powerful enough to deal with both. See, we would never chase the Father or pursue him. We would only reject him because we know deep down that we are not prepared to meet him, both on an individual level or on a corporate level. But in the face of Jesus, we see God chasing us down and inviting us into his story of restoration. And he even wants to use you to spread that good news, just like he did this woman at the well. It starts with us being honest about where we are, surrendering our life to him, giving up power and control, quit thinking our own way can work. And when we do that, because of the work of Jesus, in exchange, we receive the living water that truly satisfies. We don't have to, like the nation of Israel in the book of Amos, wander from town to town in false wells, looking for something to just quench our thirst. We don't have to go to some so-called sacred places to fake some religious ceremonies, because the glory of God has burst forth into all of life, all people, all times, all places. And the water of life, we're told in Revelation, is available to all who would thirst and run to Jesus. And when we're fully satisfied in Jesus, we're free. Doesn't mean life's perfect on this side of the new creation, but we are actually transformed, and then our lives begin to reveal that. We have the power of the Spirit. The same one who creates wind and forms mountains is now inside of you, creating a new heart, sanctifying you, and within our midst as a body, sanctifying us into his image, forming us into the sanctified bride of Christ. True preparation to meet God only comes through exchanging our false religion or our full rejection of God for the finished work of Jesus. And when that happens, true worship flows from our hearts into the streets. And not just by the songs we sing on Sundays or the gifts that we give to the church, though that can be a part of it. It's also in the everyday working for justice in the streets, feeding the poor, clothing the naked, working for just laws, defending the cause of the needy and outcast, and all the while sharing the hope of the gospel of Jesus as the reason we do it. Again, it's not just some fad. It's not just something we do. It's because of Jesus. And so my prayer for us is that New Eden would be a church that is transformed because it's met God in the face of Jesus. Because when that happens, we can't stay the same.